Rain poured over the cemetery, soaking the freshly turned earth and the black polished coffin suspended above the grave. Min-jae's men stood like statues, silent and deadly, their eyes fixed on the descending wood. Lee Min-jae himself loomed at the edge, coat plastered to his frame, hands trembling as he signaled his men. Every detail screamed power, control, finality, but the moment shattered with a piercing voice. "She's breathing." Clara's scream cut through the storm, fragile but unwavering. Her tiny fists clutched the iron gates, muddy shoes sinking into the wet ground. She refused to step back, refused to hide, refusing to accept the finality Min-jae had decreed. For a heartbeat, the storm hushed, the men froze. A child, alone and terrified, dared to confront Korea's most feared mafia boss, and the world held its breath. Wait, can one child really stop a mafia boss? If you think courage has no age limit, smash that like button right now. Drop a fire in the comments if you'd stand up to evil. And hit subscribe, because this story is about to get even more intense. Alright, let's get back to the cemetery, where Clara is about to do the unthinkable. Clara had never meant to be here. The cemetery was far from the orphanage where she lived, a place she knew only from stories Soo-yeon had shared during their brief visits. Soo-yeon had volunteered there for years, bringing warmth and laughter to the children, teaching them songs, stories, and the courage to believe in something bigger than themselves. Clara remembered the first time Soo-yeon had knelt beside her, brushing dirt from her sleeves, whispering, "Bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do despite it." That memory had stayed with her, a fragile flame against the cold world she navigated alone. Earlier that morning, Clara had seen Min-jae leave the orphanage in a sleek black car, his expression unyielding, his presence both commanding and terrifying. Something in the air had told her that today was different. A sense of dread, prickling along her spine, whispered that something was very wrong. She had followed him from a distance, slipping through the puddles and mud, her small frame hunched against the rain. The further she went, the heavier her heart became, each step punctuated by the fear she had been taught to respect, yet refused to obey. She recalled the stories Soo-yeon had told her about women who had been taken too soon, about the fragility of life and the courage required to hold on to hope. And now, seeing the black car disappear behind the cemetery gate, Clara's instincts screamed louder than her fear. Her legs ached, her shoes caked with mud, but she pushed forward, driven by a mix of terror and determination. She had to know what had happened. When she finally glimpsed the coffin, slick with rain and soil, and saw Min-jae standing above it with his men like sentinels, the truth hit her like a cold gust of wind. Something was horribly wrong. The fear that had curled in her stomach now spurred her onward. She didn't understand everything, the politics, the violence, the code of the mafia, but she understood what mattered. Someone needed help. Someone needed her voice. Clara's small hand clutched the iron gate tighter, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the scene ahead. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to hide, to vanish into the rain and be safe. But the memory of Soo-yeon's gentle smile, the warmth in her voice, and the stories of courage she had been told echoed louder than fear. She would not leave. She would not let silence bury the truth. Whatever it took, she would follow Min-jae, even into the storm, even into danger, because she knew that some things were worth every trembling step. The mud soaked her shoes, the rain plastered her hair to her cheeks, but her determination did not waver. Today, she would stand. Today, she would not be invisible. Today, she would try to save a life. Lee Min-jae moved through the rain-soaked cemetery with the precision of a man who had spent decades commanding fear and obedience. His reputation alone kept entire neighborhoods silent at the mere whisper of his name. Men who had once stood toe-to-toe with him in violence now trembled at his shadow, and even the police tread carefully, wary of the consequences. To the outside world, he was untouchable, ruthless, a force that brooked no mercy. Yet beneath that armor of power, a single vulnerability had always existed: Soo-yeon. Soo-yeon had been the exception in a life defined by brutality. In her presence, Min-jae's cold, unyielding heart had found warmth. Her laughter, soft and unassuming, had pierced through the years of violence and paranoia that shaped him. He remembered the evenings they spent walking through the city, her hand in his, speaking of dreams and kindness, of helping those who had nothing. It had been a rare, fragile light in a world otherwise dominated by shadows. The memory of the night she died clawed at him as he approached the freshly dug grave. She had fallen ill suddenly, collapsing into a deep, unresponsive state, her lips pale, her pulse nearly imperceptible. The doctor's hurried whispers spoke of a rare toxin, a mistake, or a malicious act, and Min-jae had been left with a suffocating sense of helplessness. Panic had surged through him as he watched the woman he loved slip into what appeared to be eternal sleep, the very life he sought to protect being ripped away. No one could know the truth, not his men, not the rival families, not the law. Questions would lead to danger. Exposure would invite attacks on all fronts. So he had made the only decision he thought possible: secret burial. No ceremony, no witnesses, no time for grief to be exploited. A quiet erasure, a way to contain his sorrow and the risk it carried. His men had followed his orders without hesitation, their trained faces unreadable as they prepared to lower the coffin. Yet even as he commanded the ritual, a part of him recoiled. Every beat of his own heart felt heavy, weighted with grief and guilt. Soo-yeon had been more than a wife. She had been the tether to his humanity, the one person who could see past the reputation, past the empire of fear, into the man he had once been beneath the armor. The thought of burying her without knowing, without certainty, gnawed at the edges of his resolve, but he steeled himself. In the underworld he ruled, weakness meant death. Yet even the strongest hearts could ache, could hesitate, could remember what it meant to love. Clara's voice trembled through the rain, piercing the night air as she screamed again, "She's breathing." Her small frame shook with desperation, and the wet hem of her dress clung to her like a second skin. Every muscle in her body urged her forward, toward the coffin, toward the impossible truth she refused to ignore. Her eyes, wide and unyielding, scanned every shadow, every movement, every indication that life might still linger beneath the polished wood. Memories surged unbidden, a torrent she had fought to suppress for years. She saw her mother's face, pale and unmoving in a hospital bed, hooked to machines that beeped faintly in the sterile silence. Doctors had whispered, words muffled by the haze of fear. "She might not make it. We're doing all we can." Clara had clutched her mother's hand, feeling its unnatural coolness, and yet she had known. She had known that the stillness of skin did not always mean the stillness of life. She had counted breaths, watched chests rise and fall minutely, hoping, pleading for a spark. That trauma had etched into her a reflex, an instinct that refused to ignore signs of life, no matter how faint. Now, standing over another seemingly lifeless form, the memory surged with painful clarity. Clara's small hands reached out, trembling as she placed them on the coffin lid, urging it to open, demanding proof, a pulse, a breath, anything. The fear that gripped her as a child, the helplessness that had clawed at her chest while her mother hovered between life and death, fueled her courage now. This was no longer just fear. It was a precise, urgent knowledge of what it meant to assume life had left when it had not. Min-jae watched from a few paces away, his dark eyes narrowing as he tried to suppress the unease rising in his chest. The command to bury had seemed clear, irreversible, necessary. But as Clara's cries pierced the air, something he had long buried within himself, the part that Soo-yeon had always reached, stirred. Her insistence, the raw, unfiltered certainty in her small voice, struck a chord he hadn't felt in years. For a moment, the storm of his ruthlessness faltered, and he glimpsed the dangerous vulnerability that love had once carved into his life. The cemetery, drenched in rain, became a crucible of conflicting emotions. Clara's determination, born of personal trauma and intimate understanding of life's fragile hold, collided with Min-jae's long-honed control and fear of exposure. The tension was almost unbearable, the silence between each of Clara's desperate cries echoing like a drumbeat in the darkness. He stood there, the weight of his choices pressing against his chest, as he realized that this child, this girl, might awaken something even he could not control. This is getting emotional, isn't it? If this story is giving you chills, show some love, hit that like button. Comment below, never give up if you believe in second chances. And subscribe so you never miss stories where hope defeats darkness. Now, back to the graveyard, where everything is about to explode. Min-jae's eyes darkened as he watched Clara, her small frame trembling with defiance, refusing to look away from the coffin. The rain fell heavier now, blurring the edges of the graveyard, and for the first time in years, he felt a fissure crack through the armor he had built around his heart. His mind drifted back, unbidden, to a memory that had always made him both ache and smile. The night Soo-yeon would come to his modest apartment with her boundless warmth, bringing children from the orphanage she volunteered at. He saw Clara once, younger, sitting cross-legged at his dinner table, noodles slipping from her chopsticks as she laughed at Soo-yeon's teasing. Soo-yeon had insisted that he join in, that he taste the noodles, that he engage in their small, tender world. Even in his darkest days, she had managed to show him a universe he had thought forbidden, a world where innocence and laughter could coexist with power and fear. That memory now pressed against him, a sharp contrast to the storm of ruthlessness that had defined his every decision since her death. Clara's voice rang out again, small but unwavering. "She's breathing. You can't just bury her." Her words were unpolished, raw, but they carried the same values Soo-yeon had lived by: courage, compassion, and an insistence on seeing the humanity in every life. It was uncanny, almost unbearable, how much the girl reminded him of her. The way she refused to stand down, the way she demanded truth over assumption, hope over fear. Min-jae's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking. He wanted to silence her, to maintain control, but every instinct he had spent decades sharpening wavered. His men shifted behind him, boots squelching in the mud. Some exchanged impatient glances, their hands brushing against the weapons they carried, ready to enforce the orders he had given. The tension rippled through the group, a dangerous current waiting to spark. Min-jae felt their expectation pressing on him, their readiness to act without hesitation. And yet the image of Soo-yeon and the echo of Clara's cry anchored him, preventing a snap decision that would leave him forever changed. He inhaled sharply, feeling the weight of every choice pressing on his chest. Every instinct screamed to maintain the iron grip he had perfected over the years, but memory, compassion, and the persistence of a small girl refused to let him. In that moment, he was caught between two worlds: the ruthless authority that had earned him fear and respect, and the fragile, tender humanity that Soo-yeon had once revealed to him, now mirrored in Clara's unwavering courage. The armor that had always seemed impenetrable was beginning to crack, and Min-jae knew it. The storm around them, both literal and emotional, showed no signs of relenting. Clara's small legs pumped furiously through the mud, her black dress clinging to her in the pouring rain, but she didn't care. Every step brought her closer to the coffin that held Soo-yeon, the woman who had changed her life, the only person who had ever truly seen her. Her heart pounded, adrenaline and fear fused into raw determination, and she shoved past Min-jae's men as if they were nothing. Her voice rang across the graveyard again, louder, sharper, desperate. "She's breathing. You have to check." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Min-jae froze, his hand rising, not to strike, not to order, but to halt his own men. Their rough hands hovered mid-air, weapons forgotten in their sudden awareness that the boss's gaze was no longer the iron command they had followed without question. In that instant, Min-jae's eyes met Clara's, and a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a fragile, dangerous truce in the chaos of the storm. He would check. Memories surged unbidden, flickering like candlelight through the darkness of his mind. He remembered Su Yun's gentle insistence on seeing the world through a child's eyes, her warmth in their small apartment, the way she had laughed at his awkward attempts to connect, the way she had always reached out to the vulnerable and the innocent. Clara's plea was more than just a child's defiance. It was Su Yun's values incarnate, demanding recognition and compassion even in the shadow of death. The men's impatience buzzed like electricity around them, tense and dangerous, but Min Jae's raised hand was a barrier, his voice a low command. Hold. Even in his silence, the weight of his decision pressed down on him, a choice that could redefine everything he believed about power, control, and loyalty. He felt the old instincts screaming to maintain dominance, to bury all vulnerability along with the coffin. But another part, softer, almost forgotten, whispered that perhaps there was more to consider. Clara crouched beside the coffin, drenched and trembling, yet undeterred. Her small hands gripped the edges of the polished wood as her eyes searched, pleading, demanding, refusing to accept what seemed inevitable. The rain-slicked hair clinging to her forehead mirrored the tears streaking her cheeks, a portrait of courage raw and unyielding. The air was electric with tension, the storm outside echoing the storm within the Mafia Boss, as he stared at the girl who had forced him to confront the humanity he had long buried beneath a fortress of fear. Min Jae's chest tightened, the storm of duty and grief colliding in a single, defining moment. One choice, one movement, could shatter or save, and the world held its breath alongside Clara, waiting. Your heart's racing, right? Mine too. If you're on the edge of your seat, prove it, like this video right now. Comment "She's alive" if you think there's hope. Subscribe and turn on notifications because you need to see how this ends. Okay, deep breath. Let's find out the truth. The coffin lid groaned as it was lifted, slow and deliberate, the weight of anticipation pressing down on every witness in the rain-soaked cemetery. Clara's hands trembled on the edge of the wood, eyes wide and unblinking, searching for any sign of life in Su Yun's pale, motionless face. The storm above seemed to hush itself, raindrops frozen in midair, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Min Jae stood rigid, a statue of tension, his dark eyes locked on the woman who had been the only warmth in his cold, ruthless existence. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. The wind whispered through the bare trees, carrying Clara's shallow, terrified breaths. Every second stretched endlessly, her heart hammering against her ribs, a drum of hope and despair. Su Yun's chest lay still, the fragile line of her lips unmoving, her hands folded gently on her chest. Min Jae's jaw tightened, a storm of conflicting emotions behind his sharp gaze. Duty, fear, disbelief, and an unfamiliar glimmer of fear for something he had long buried beneath power and control. Then it came, a faint, almost imperceptible exhale. A mist rose in the cold air, curling like a fragile wisp of hope. Clara gasped, disbelief mixing with tears as she pressed closer, shivering, soaked, but utterly relentless. Her fingers brushed the edge of Su Yun's wrist, trembling at the life that quivered beneath her touch. The sound of that tiny, fragile breath seemed to echo across the graveyard, silencing even the impatient murmurs of Min Jae's men. Min Jae's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground in a rush of relief and disbelief, his hand covering his mouth as the reality hit him. The unthinkable, the impossible, was true. Su Yun was alive. Clara's tears fell freely now, mixing with the rain as she collapsed onto her knees, exhausted, relieved, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of survival. Her small frame shook, but her face shone with triumph and love, the echo of her screams still lingering in the air, no longer desperate, but victorious. The men looked on, silent and uncertain. Their leaders collapsed, shattering the rigid order they had maintained, leaving a space for wonder, fear, and awe. The storm continued to lash against them, but inside the circle of that open coffin, something had shifted. Life had returned where death had seemed absolute, a fragile miracle carried on a single breath, witnessed by a child whose courage had refused to be silenced. Did you see that? She's alive. If that moment just broke you, smash that like button with everything you've got. Drop a red heart in the comments for Clara's bravery. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Stories like this don't come around every day. But hold on, this story isn't over yet. Let's see what happens next. The wail of the ambulance siren cut through the night as it rounded the cemetery gate, flashing red and blue against the rain-slicked gravestones. Clara stumbled back, drenched and trembling, as Minjae's men exchanged uncertain glances and, one by one, melted into the shadows, leaving only the boss and the girl at the edge of the grave. The tension in the air was sharp enough to taste, a mix of fear, relief, and disbelief. Minjae bent over the coffin, lifting Su-Yun with the care of a man who had never allowed himself to show tenderness before. Her body felt impossibly light in his arms, a fragile vessel of life that defied the darkness that had threatened to claim her. His hand gripped hers, cold and trembling, but steady enough to anchor both of them against the storm. Clara watched from the edge of the grave, soaked, exhausted, and yet filled with an unstoppable sense of triumph. She had fought for this moment, and it had come. The ambulance doors opened, and Minjae stepped inside with Su-Yun, the rain pelting against the metal roof. Clara hesitated, wanting to follow, but something in her chest told her this was not her fight anymore. She had done her part. The flash of determination in her small frame mirrored the courage that had refused to bow to fear all night. Minjae caught her gaze from inside the vehicle, a fleeting acknowledgement that she had changed the course of everything. Inside the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. Doctors hovered around Su-Yun, their voices low but urgent, and monitors beeped steadily, a fragile rhythm that matched the pulse of hope. One of them explained that she had been poisoned by a rare, slow-acting toxin, one that mimicked death with eerie perfection. The coma state had been deep, nearly imperceptible, enough to convince even those closest to her that life had slipped away. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, fragile but defiant. Minjae sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. The weight of the past hours pressed down on him, the fear, the guilt, the love he had kept locked away until now. Every breath she took seemed to reverberate through his chest, shaking the foundations of his carefully constructed world. Outside, Clara stood quietly, her small frame silhouetted against the rain-slicked windows, letting the gravity of her triumph settle in. She had faced a monster, challenged death itself, and prevailed. Even as the storm outside raged, a fragile calm settled over the room. The battle had not ended. The night had not yet fully released its hold, but for the first time, the impossible seemed tangible, and life, precarious, miraculous life, hung in balance, sustained by courage, love, and the faint, steady rise and fall of a single breath. Su-Yun's eyes fluttered open slowly, the hospital ceiling coming into hazy focus, as if she were waking from a dream she couldn't quite place. Everything felt heavy, foreign, and yet there was a warmth she recognized immediately. Minjae had not left her side. His hand gripped hers with a quiet intensity, a silent promise that he would not let go. He watched her carefully, reading each blink and each shallow breath as though deciphering a secret language only the two of them could understand. "Minjae," she whispered, her voice fragile and unsure. Her mind scrambled to place the hours, or had it been days, that had passed in darkness. The sterile hum of monitors and the distant murmur of doctors filled the room, but it was his presence that anchored her. "You're awake," he said simply, his voice steady but soft, betraying a vulnerability he had never shown in the world outside these walls. "You owe your life to a brave little girl, Clara. She saved you. You have to thank her when you can." His words hung in the air, strange and almost surreal to Su-Yun, who tried to process the idea of a child standing against the tide of death itself. Minjae's eyes darkened with determination, his mind already racing. "We have to find her," he murmured, almost to himself. "She risked everything to save you. She deserves to know what she's done, and I will make sure she's safe." His fingers tightened around Suyun's hand, but there was a gentleness now, an acknowledgement of fragility that had never existed in him before. 3 days later, Minjae stood at the gates of the orphanage where Clara lived, the rain having washed the world clean, yet leaving it cold and stark. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the enormity of his task settling like stone in his chest. Clara had faced horrors no child should ever know, and yet here she was, brave and defiant, standing between innocence and the shadow of fear. The orphanage caretaker, a woman whose soft eyes masked a life of struggle, looked up at him in surprise. Minjae's presence was commanding, impossible to ignore, yet there was a careful restraint in his posture. "I'm looking for a girl named Clara," he said, his voice firm but not threatening. "She's very important. I need to see her." Inside, Clara looked up from her small reading corner. Her fingers paused on the tattered pages. She recognized him instantly, the man from the cemetery, the man who had held life itself in his hands. And yet, in that instant, there was no fear, just the quiet pride of a child who had faced the impossible and prevailed. Minjae stepped closer, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "Clara," he said, the name heavy with respect and gratitude. "You saved someone very dear to me. I wanted to thank you properly." His eyes softened, the hard edges of the Mafia Boss momentarily eroded by something far stronger: acknowledgement, respect, and the seed of trust. Minjae knelt before Clara, the mud from the rainy street still clinging to her tiny shoes. The world around them, the orphanage walls, the gray skies, even the distant hum of the city, seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a moment suspended between fear and hope. He lowered himself carefully, as if matching his height to hers could somehow bridge the impossible gap between their worlds. I don't know how to thank you," he admitted, his voice unsteady for the first time in decades. The unyielding aura of the Mafia Boss, the man who had commanded loyalty and fear, was gone, replaced by something fragile, yet infinitely more powerful: humility. He had faced countless threats, crossed every line imaginable, yet this child had done what no power or weapon could. She had saved a life, shaken the core of his cold heart, and shown him a mirror of humanity he thought long buried. Clara looked at him, her small face streaked with mud and tears, but her eyes clear and unwavering. I just didn't want her to be alone in the dark," she said simply. No grand gestures, no speeches of bravery, just the pure, unpretentious truth of a child acting out of compassion. Her innocence carried a weight far beyond her years, and Minjae felt it like a pulse in the marrow of his bones. He swallowed hard, the enormity of what had happened crashing over him. For the first time, he truly understood that courage was not measured in fearsome acts or ruthless power. It was measured in selflessness, in the choice to stand for someone else when the world demanded silence. Clara's tiny hands had held more power that day than any of his men, any of his schemes, any empire he had built. As he rose slowly, Minjae looked around at the world with eyes that had begun to change. The path he had walked for years, paved with fear, control, and death, suddenly seemed narrower, more hollow. Clara's courage had peeled back the layers he had hidden behind, exposing the man he could be if he chose a different way. In that instant, he made a silent promise. He would protect her, honor her, and let the light she had sparked guide the shadows within him. The city outside could remain dangerous, the streets could still whisper with threats, but a new direction had been carved into his life, subtle yet unshakable. Clara's small smile, muddy shoes and all, lingered in his mind as he stood. Her courage had not only saved a life, it had reshaped the man who had once believed he was untouchable. Her courage had just rewritten his fate. Wow. Just wow. Clara saved a life with nothing but courage and a voice that refused to stay silent. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of one person standing up to darkness, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all sizes. Comment below, what would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have run away or run toward danger to save a life? And listen, if you want more stories that will restore your faith in humanity, stories where the underdog wins and hope never dies, subscribe and turn on that notification bell. Because next time, we've got another story that'll leave you speechless. I'll see you there. Remember, sometimes the smallest voice carries the loudest truth. Stay brave, stay kind, and never stop believing that one person can change everything.